In this video, we will explore the nature of beneficial mutations and look at the limitations and the patterns that we see in these beneficial mutations. Now, a beneficial mutation is called an adaptation. So that's something that allows you to survive, thrive, and do well in your environment. And so I've got an image here of a frog that looks unusual. Most frogs don't look like this, but this one looks like a dead leaf, and it lives down on the forest floor. So if I were to ask you the question and say, is having a mutation that makes you appear as if you're a dead leaf an adaptation, right? Is it a beneficial thing? Now, I've biased you here by showing you this picture. You would immediately answer, yeah, that's a good thing. But remember, most frogs don't have that. And maybe that random mutation has never occurred in those populations, but also we need to remember that adaptations are completely context dependent. What I mean is it depends on your environment. So if you're a frog living in a pond with no dead leaves around at all, looking like a dead leaf may not be an advantage. If you're living up in the canopy of the rainforest, then looking like a dead leaf is probably not an advantage. So anytime if somebody asks you if something is an adaptation, you need to pause and think about the environment. Or if someone just asks you a question, which you might see in an exam, context independent, so free of any background. If someone says, is fill in the blank an adaptation? You need to say, well, we don't know. We need more information. So for instance, if you're a bird, is being pink like a flamingo, is that an adaptation? And you'd say, well, I don't know, I need some dependent. And this is also important. Not every single trait that animals have are adaptations. Some of them are just random variation that really is not good or bad. It might be the consequence of something else. So it's thought that flamingos are pink because of a byproduct of their food source. And there's probably, and I'm not a flamingo expert, so if somebody wants to look into this and correct me or not, but you can, but it's probably not an adaptation to be pink. It's just a byproduct, and it's not good or bad to be pink. It's just a byproduct of the food. So in this case, based on the environment, it's a pretty safe assumption that for this frog at least, having these changes that make them look like a dead leaf is an adaptation. And environment can change over time, and as environment changes, what is an adaptation, what isn't an adaptation might change also. So a fairly simple example here in these plants is when plants flower. And we're actually seeing this in many different species of plants as climate change begins to make the earth warm up earlier in some areas. So the ancestral population of these flowers bloomed about 60 days after I think this is after the seeds first sprout, right? So after a seed sprouts, we've got about 60 days to flowering. And in a cooler environment, that's going to be the best trait, the best thing to do. However, now, 20 years later or so, I guess this is not quite 20 years later. This is more like, 1997? It's only 7 years later, right? So we've got a difference. So anyway, later as environment changes, there is a shift towards having earlier flowering. And this is an adaptation to a warmer environment where you want to flower early. So again, flowering time and when that flowering occurs may have different adaptations and different answers depending on the environment in which you're placed. Now, we could do this free of any climate change also. So if you're living way high up on a mountain where it's cooler and the growing season is shorter, probably flowering time, it's better to flower earlier rather than later if you're down at a lower elevation where you have longer growing seasons and warmer temperatures. So remember, adaptations are completely dependent on the environment. What's good and what's bad you need to have some background information to decide. So I'm going to show you this again because I think it's useful. Let's move this over just a bit so you can read it. I think it's useful to think about this because it's a little bit of a surprise. We're still not going to talk a whole lot about those neutral mutations. We're going to save that for our lecture on genetic drift. But I want to modify the pie chart that I showed you in the last video. And in the last video, if you remember, we had about 95% of mutations being effectively neutral. Now notice that hasn't changed. However, we've lost the negative mutations. Remember, they made up about 5 or maybe less than 5% of the overall pie. But now negative mutations have disappeared, and positive mutations now are at 5%. So think of this. The original slice of the pie that was positive mutations was less than 0.1%, little tiny fraction. So how did we expand that to 5%? Okay, so first off, let's look at what happened to the negative mutations. Now, the original pie chart was just when the mutation first occurs. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it neutral? But remember, after mutations occur, then the other force of evolution begin to work on them. So we have mutation occurring, bringing in all this diversity randomly, random changes. And then genetic drift and natural selection can begin to work on those mutations. And negative mutations, right, those that are, some people call them disadvantageous or detrimental. So the opposite of an adaptation, basically. Those are removed by natural selection. Now, in reality, we're never going to see all negative mutations removed. So there's still going to be some negative mutations, but they're going to be worked on, and eventually, if they really are negative, they will be removed by natural selection. But because that process takes a long time in some cases, it may be, many thousands of generations before they're completely removed. So although I haven't listed them on this pie chart, there's probably going to be a little bit of negative variation still remaining in this population. But how do we grow the number of positive mutations? We go from 0.1% to 5%. And you're like, wait a second, if new mutations that are beneficial can only occur when a mutation occurs, right? That's the only way to bring in a new thing that's beneficial. And your original pie chart was supposed to show all of the mutations. How did we grow this? And the answer is we really didn't grow it. But what happened was we lost many of the neutral mutations. And neutral mutations, by definition, are not impacted by natural selection. However, they are impacted by genetic drift. And by random chance, many of the neutral mutations are lost from a population. And we're not going to look at the mechanisms of that now, but we will at a later date. So just for now, know that many of the original neutral mutations are eventually lost. Some of them are kept in the population, but at a much lower overall number, which allows this positive slice of the pie, so to speak, to grow in proportion. It itself stays the same, but because the neutral mutations become so much lower, there's so many fewer neutral mutations after genetic drift works on them, that the overall proportion of the positive mutations can grow. And then the negative mutations get worked on both by genetic drift and natural selection. And natural selection has a very strong removal force on those negative mutations, so they become very small. All right, so as we look at this part of the pie, what part are biologists most interested in? And the short answer is, well, it depends on the scientist, and we're going to be interested in all of them. But historically, especially going back to the time of Darwin, the part of the pie that biologists focused on, in fact, the only part that Darwin really looked at, were the positive mutations, and I guess on the flip side, what happened to negative mutations. But these positive mutations are what bring in new adaptations. They are what make organisms adapt and fit into their environment. So really, this green slice of the pie gets a huge percentage of attention. Modern genetics has allowed us also to focus on the neutral part and understand it. And it plays some very critical and important roles in our ability to analyze and describe populations. But really, when we're looking at what makes a giraffe different from an antelope, what makes a whale different from other mammals, we're really looking at this small part of the pie where a random mutation occurred. It was a benefit in the environment the organism was living in, and so was kept and selected for and made that organism different. So we really give a large amount of our attention to these adaptations. So let's talk more about adaptations. Now, in order for natural selection to work on a population, there initially needs to be variation, right? And we know where that comes from. It comes from random mutations. So here we have an example that we used earlier in an earlier video where we talked about how there might be variation in a beetle population with some color variation, and then this color variation also allows those organisms to have some sort of a toxicity. So red beetles not only have a color red, but they're also toxic and predators don't like them. Now, if this variability is not inherited, we still can't have natural selection. And there is some variability that is not inherited that's just caused by your environment. We'll look at an example, kind of a silly example, but one I think that illustrates the point in our next slide. And then finally, not only does this variability need to be inherited, but it needs to have some sort of an advantage-disadvantage continuum. So in this case, it's a disadvantage to be yellow because you're not toxic to birds. They pick you up, you taste fine, they eat you, and you die at a higher rate than if you would be red. The red beetles, birds might attack you, but you're toxic. You make their mouth burn or make them throw up or something. And so birds, which are pretty smart animals, learn soon to stay away from the red beetles. And so it's an advantage to the population to have this red coloration. And of course, over time, if more yellow beetles are being eaten than red beetles, eventually we lose yellow beetles at some rate, and we might end up with either rapidly or slowly a population that is just completely red and somewhat toxic so that the birds stay away from them. Okay? So variation, heritability, and then differential success. And over time, this will cause a population to change. We lose some of the diversity and we reinforce and gain. Not really gain, because gaining was done by the first random mutation, but we take some of the variability we see in the population and make that the only thing in the population because it's an adaptation. Now, as we look across natural populations, and we'll use humans as an example because we're good at visually assessing some parts of our genetic diversity, but as we look across populations in general, we find that diversity and variety is very, very high. Now, of course, we can look at these visual features that we assess in humans: skin color, language, culture, behaviors, right? And that's something that we're kind of pre-adapted to evaluate very, very quickly. It was probably a great advantage in our past if we could look at an individual and evaluate, are they just like me or different than me, and then make some assumptions and some choices based on that. And that might have been a survival trait. Today, in a modern world where it's no longer a survival trait, we're kind of seeing some of the consequences of that and trying to reevaluate and maybe adjust how we are programmed, if you will. Some of this may be genetic, but probably a lot of it is also passed down and inherited from our environment. So how we judge people and how we assess people. Now, we can do the same thing for other organisms, but we might need a lot of training. So if I was to say, here's 1 million fruit flies, you'd look at them and say, yeah, one fruit fly looks like the other fruit fly. They're almost all identical, unless there was some big major difference. But fruit flies are looking at one another and assessing one another, assessing fitness, assessing traits, deciding whether they want to mate with an individual or not. And so to a fruit fly, they may see, quote unquote, assess, sense variety and diversity that we don't see immediately. But if we were trained and looked carefully, then we might see more of that diversity. And so when we look at other populations with a more trained and an observant eye, we notice the same thing that we see in the human population, that there's tons and tons of diversity. And all of it, this is redundant, but it's important, I'm going to reinforce it, all of that diversity originates as a new random mutation. So let's give you kind of a silly, humorous example of a trait, and then you tell me whether or not this isn't can be in natural selection can work on it. So pierced ears, right? That's a trait that's common in many parts of human society. And we might, even today especially, we see more of this, see more extreme versions of this. Okay? So can this trait be worked on by natural selection? Now, in your head, you might have immediately said no, and that's great. That's the right answer. But now I want you to tell me why. Why isn't this trait subject to natural selection? And to do this, you go through the list, the 3 things that have to be there for natural selection. Number 1 is variability in the population. And certainly we have that with pierced ears, right? Some people have a single hole, some people have multiple piercings, other people have these large gauges in their ears. That's diversity and variety. So We checked off number 1 in our checklist of what needs to be there for natural selection, diversity and variety. Number 2, does this, well, let's flip it a little bit. Let's look at number 3 first. So number 3 on our list was, does it provide an advantage? So here are some uses, perhaps, for having larger piercings in your ear. And again, this is kind of a humorous example. I think that was the intent when people took these pictures, to kind of be silly and funny, right? And I jokingly put this here, is an advantage to have an extra carrying place on your body? Probably not. Probably doesn't really provide an advantage. But I want you to now start to think about, what do we mean when we say adaptation or advantage? What does that mean? And another term that's very commonly used that we're going to define and talk about in this next discussion is, well, actually in this discussion, is fitness. Okay? So fitness is simply a way to quantitatively measure an adaptation. How good is it? Is it a big advantage, or is it a little advantage? And so when it comes to fitness, when it comes to adaptations, it's really all about your ability to reproduce. It's all about reproduction. Because if you have the best adaptation, lets you survive, lets you do amazingly well, lets you survive really, really long, but it doesn't provide any ability to reproduce and pass that on at a higher rate, then it's not going to be acted on by natural selection, because it needs to be inherited. And if it's not inherited, the natural selection can't work on it. So we would maybe have a big question mark for pierced ears. Even though there's lots of variety and diversity, it probably doesn't provide any measurable adaptation. But remember, any measurable increase in fitness. Remember, though, if this fitness increase allows you to do better but not reproduce more, not pass on your genes that are making you so quote-unquote fit, then it's not really fitness. So it's about survival, if that survival allows you to reproduce more. And so a trait that makes you die earlier but allows you to reproduce more might actually be more of an adaptation than this trait that on the surface looks like a benefit but doesn't allow you to pass it on to the next generation. So it's all about your ability to reproduce. And if survival allows you to reproduce, yep, then it's an adaptation. But if survival just makes you live a longer life and not reproduce anymore, then that's not an adaptation. And of course, finally, the second thing on our list when we were looking at it back here, right, is heritability. And so not only would this probably not be subject to natural selection, not be called an adaptation, because it probably wouldn't provide any true advantage, but in addition, this is not inherited, right? So if you go out and pierce your ears and put large gauges in your ear and then reproduce, you're not going to have offspring with big holes in their ears, right? If pierced ears were inherited, then pretty soon body piercers would go out of business, or at least have much less business, right? Because as parents who had pierced ears had offspring, their offspring would have pierced ears and so on. But that's not the way that inheritance works. That would be a very Lamarckian mechanism. But we know that that's not the way that traits are passed on. Okay, so phenotype. Remember that phenotype is a combination of genetics and environment. And it's never 100%, but it can be close. So your eye color is nearly 100% genetics, right? But there's some extreme environmental changes that maybe could have an impact on eye color. Same thing here. Although pierced ears are nearly 100% environmental cultural, we might see rare individuals that are born with a defect or some sort of a hole, I guess, is I'm trying to think of a better word, but some sort of a hole in their ear, and that's probably very, very rare. So this is 99.999% environmental. Other traits might be mostly environment, but then there are other traits that are a really good mix, right? So if I look at heart disease, for instance, heart disease is one of those, like, are you going to have a heart attack? That is determined partially by your genes and partially by your environment, right? What you choose to eat. An environment can be things that you have control over, like your diet, but it can also be things that maybe you have very little control over that you're just exposed to because of where or when you live. Okay, so heart disease is probably, and I don't know the numbers, but 60-70% environment, right? Do you have a good diet? Do you eat? And 30% genetics. But there's some genetic traits that have a much larger influence than others. Okay, so phenotype is both environment and genotype. Now, we are going to begin to try and put numbers on, and I'm not going to actually make you assess this, but I do want you to understand in general terms how it's done. We're going to begin to quantitatively measure fitness. So, is being lightly colored, so if you have a very light coat as a mouse, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So is being a lightly colored mouse an adaptation? Now, hopefully I didn't trick you this time, and I've got more variety and diversity here, so I'm not biasing you with this image as much. But hopefully your answer is, it depends, right? So where do you live? Do you live in an area with a very dark soil, dark substrate? If so, then having a lightly colored coat is not going to be an adaptation. And so we want to try and measure and assess quantitatively whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, the way that we do this, the most consistent way, is that we do something called relative fitness. Now, relative fitness tries to take advantage, or you measure all of the environment. It can be really, really tricky to do. So we measure every single thing, other organisms, temperature, color, whatever it might be. We try to assess everything. But in addition, we do it in comparison to other organisms. And we assign the most fit phenotype a fitness level of 1. Move this down just a bit. So the most fit phenotype equals 1. A fitness level of 0 means that you're either dead or you're sterile. There's no way you can pass your genes on to the next generation. Okay? So we now have a continuum where we have the most fit phenotype being a 1 and the least fit phenotype being a 0. And remember that that relative fitness depends on environment. So in this environment, based on the experimental data where they were monitoring mice and 53% of the light-coated mice were captured, but only 32% of the dark-coated mice were captured, then this dark-coated phenotype would get a fitness level of 1, and this would be somewhere between 0 and 1 because they're not surviving as well. But in this environment, they're a little bit more similar, and in this environment, this individual would get a fitness level of 1, right, because it has the highest survival rate. And this would get a fitness level of somewhere between 0 and 1. Okay, so hopefully that's fairly straightforward. And if we have a complex mix of environments, then we're going to maintain diversity. Now, if we're in an environment where everything is dark soil and these individuals are not doing very well, over time they're going to get eaten at a higher rate. They're not going to be able to reproduce as much, and eventually we will lose these light-coated trait. It might take many thousands of generations depending on the genetics of that trait, depending on the force of the selection, depending on how stable the environment is, and if there are other little areas where they could run away to and get more of an advantage. But eventually, if overall it's a disadvantage, then we'll lose it. But if we do have areas where it's an advantage, if we have other features going on, it can take many thousands of generations, even if a trait is disadvantageous, to remove it from a population. And so here we have an example where they've measured areas where fairly close proximity, this is on the coast of the panhandle of Florida, that there are these mice, and they've measured this experimentally, that in an area, a few miles away from the beach, that the darker coated ones do better because they're blending in, but along the beach areas where we have lots of white sand, the lighter ones do better. And so especially if they're interbreeding, we're going to maintain diversity because the adaptation in one area is different than the adaptation in another area. And so scientists would measure fitness, assign levels, and then maybe even do some projections and some calculations as to which of those populations would survive or if we're going to see trends and changes over time. And so putting numbers, right, relative fitness numbers onto individuals in the population allows scientists to measure, assess, and do a lot of really useful things with these populations. Now remember, we try to isolate and set up experiments so we can just look at one feature at a time. But organisms are complex mixtures of many, many thousands of features. So an organism's overall fitness level would depend not just on its coat color, but on dozens and dozens of other characteristics. And so that also can complicate how organisms are going to react and adapt to their